Brother would be the reason I stopped answering unknown numbers, but that's exactly where my life started falling apart. Slowly and quietly, the way it always does when the damage comes from inside your own family. Because the first sign wasn't a confrontation or a fight, it was a letter. A plain white envelope waiting in my mailbox with my name printed neatly across the front. The kind of letter you don't expect unless you've applied for something important. And I hadn't, so I opened it, standing right there by the door, skimming the words until one sentence made my stomach drop so hard I had to sit down. Because, according to that letter, I had been approved for a personal loan I never asked for, one that was already active, already accumulating interest, and already tied to my credit. And at first, I honestly laughed, a short, nervous laugh, telling myself it had to be a mistake, some clerical error, because I'd never taken out a loan in my life, not a big one at least, and definitely not recently. But when I logged into my credit report to double-check, the laughter disappeared, replaced by this cold pressure in my chest. Because there it was, in black and white, my name, my information, my social security number, all correct, all used perfectly, which meant whoever did this knew me well enough to pretend to be me. And there was only one person who had that kind of access, my older brother. The same brother who'd always needed just a little help. The same brother my parents defended every time he messed up. The same brother who borrowed money from relatives and somehow never paid it back. And I didn't want to believe it. I really didn't, because admitting it meant accepting that someone I trusted had crossed a line you don't come back from. But the pieces fit too cleanly, so I called him, trying to sound calm, trying not to accuse him outright, and asked if he knew anything about a loan in my name. And without missing a beat, he laughed and said no. Told me I was being paranoid, told me banks mess things up all the time, and for a moment, I almost let myself believe him, until I asked one more question, the kind you only ask when you already know the answer. I asked where he got the money for the new car he'd just posted online, the one he'd shown off at dinner the week before like it was nothing. And there was a pause, just long enough, followed by a joke that didn't land. And that was when I knew. But knowing and proving are two very different things. So instead of exploding, instead of accusing him and turning it into a family war, I did what no one expected me to do. I stayed quiet. I told him it was probably nothing, said I'd talk to the bank, said it would work itself out. And my parents loved that response. They told me I was being mature, that I shouldn't jump to conclusions, that family handles things privately. And for the first time in my life, I realized something important. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about him, about protecting him from consequences. And that realization hurt more than the debt itself. Because while they were telling me to stay calm, the calls from collectors kept coming, the emails kept piling up, and my credit score started slipping point by point. But every time I thought about confronting him again, I remembered the look on his face when he laughed it off. Confident, relaxed, already spending money that wasn't his, convinced he'd gotten away with it. And that was the moment I made a decision I didn't tell anyone about. Not my parents, not my friends, not even myself out loud. I decided I would let him think he'd won. Because if there was one thing I knew about my brother, it was that the more comfortable he got, the sloppier he became. And I was willing to wait. Letting my brother think he'd gotten away with it was harder than I expected, because silence isn't passive when you're the one paying the price. It's active. It's waking up every morning knowing your name is being dragged through a system that doesn't care about intentions, only numbers. And every notification on my phone felt like a reminder that time was working against me. But I forced myself to stay calm, to play the role everyone had assigned me, the reasonable sibling, the one who doesn't rock the boat. And outwardly, nothing changed. I still showed up to family dinners, still sat across from my brother while he talked loudly about his new car, his weekend trips, his plans, spending money that technically existed because my identity had funded it. And every time he caught my eye, there was this smug confidence in the way he smiled, like he knew something I didn't, like he'd pulled off the perfect crime, and all I could do was swallow it. And what made it worse was how my parents treated him during that time. How proud they sounded when they talked about him finally getting his life together. How they praised his independence without once asking how I was doing, even as my credit score dropped low enough that my bank quietly lowered my limit, a silent punishment that came with no warning and no appeal. And I realized then that if I lashed out, if I demanded justice too early, I wouldn't just be fighting my brother, I'd be fighting my entire family. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. So instead, I started documenting everything. Every call from the lender, every email, every statement that showed the loan balance inching higher. I saved screenshots, I logged dates, I learned terms I'd never cared about before. Things like liability, authorization, verification processes, and fine print. Because anger hadn't gotten me anywhere, but information might. And the more I learned, the more I understood how confident my brother had become, because he wasn't just careless, he was reckless. He'd used the loan openly, making payments inconsistently, sometimes late, sometimes not at all, assuming that if things ever went wrong, the mess would land on me, and the system would believe him over me, because families don't usually accuse each other of fraud. And that assumption, that no one would ever challenge him formally, became his biggest weakness. Because while he was busy living like the debt didn't exist, I was quietly building a timeline, a clean, undeniable record that showed exactly when the loan was opened, where the funds went, and most importantly, what I never did. I never signed anything. I never approved anything. I never benefited from a single dollar. And yet, every time I hinted at stress, my parents brushed it off, told me to stop overthinking, told me my brother would handle it, as if responsibility were contagious and would magically transfer if ignored long enough. And the worst moment came when my mother pulled me aside one evening and asked me, gently but firmly, not to report anything, not to make it a legal issue, because it would embarrass the family, because it would ruin my brother's future. And I remember standing there nodding, agreeing, saying I understood, while something inside me hardened. Because that was the moment I realized they were asking me to sacrifice my future to protect his reputation, and that was a trade I'd never agreed to. But I still didn't act, not yet, because patience was doing something powerful. It was giving my brother space to make more mistakes, to leave more evidence, to talk too much, to trust the wrong people. And he did exactly that, bragging to a cousin about how easy it was to work the system, joking about how credit companies never check hard enough when you know the right details. Words that would have sounded harmless to anyone else, but to me, they sounded like a confession waiting to be used. And by the time the loan hit a point where the lender escalated the case internally, I already knew something my brother didn't, that there was one small procedural step he'd skipped, one assumption he'd made about how identity verification works. And when I discovered it buried in a customer agreement he'd never read, I finally understood how this would end, not with a fight, not with yelling, but with him realizing, far too late, that silence hadn't meant surrender, it had meant preparation. By the time I was sure my brother had made his final mistake, I had already accepted that whatever came next would permanently change how our family looked at me, because preparation has a way of clarifying things. It strips away the illusion that justice can be clean or painless. And what I'd uncovered wasn't dramatic on the surface. It was boring, technical, the kind of detail people skip over because they assume it doesn't matter. But it mattered more than anything else, because while my brother had used my personal information to open the loan, he'd done it through an online verification process that required one extra layer of confirmation, a secondary acknowledgement step that legally counted as authorization. And that acknowledgement had been sent to a contact method he assumed was still under his control, an old email address he'd once helped me set up years ago, back when we still trusted each other. Except he hadn't realized I'd regained access to it months earlier when I was cleaning up old accounts, which meant every automated notice, every confirmation timestamp, every authorization log had quietly landed where he couldn't touch it, creating a digital trail he didn't even know existed. And once I realized that, the fear I'd been carrying around began to shift into something colder and steadier, because I didn't need to accuse him anymore. I didn't need to prove intent with emotion. The system was already doing that for me. So I took my time, reviewed everything twice, triple-checked dates, compared IP logs, payment histories, and transaction summaries, building a picture that showed a clear pattern, not just a fraud, but of confidence, because he hadn't tried to hide. He hadn't been careful. He assumed my silence meant weakness, and that assumption kept him sloppy. Meanwhile, the pressure on me kept increasing. The lender flagged the account for irregular payments, my credit score dipped low enough to affect an apartment application I'd submitted, and when I was denied, something snapped quietly inside me. Not in a dramatic way, but in the way you finally stop hoping things will resolve themselves. That was the night I made my first official move, one that didn't involve my family at all. I contacted the lender directly, not to accuse my brother by name, but to initiate a formal identity dispute, the kind that freezes an account while an investigation begins. And I still remember the calm voice on the other end of the line asking me a series of questions, routine questions, ones my brother had answered easily when he'd pretended to be me, except this time, I answered them truthfully. I explained that I had never authorized the loan, never received the funds, and had reason to believe my identity had been misused by someone with access to my personal information. And when they asked if I knew who that person might be, I said I wasn't ready to name anyone yet, which was true because I wanted the paper trail to speak first. And after that call, something changed. The phone stopped ringing, the emails slowed, the account status shifted from active to under review, and for the first time in months, I slept without checking my credit app before bed. But the real shift happened at home because my brother noticed. He noticed the lender stopped calling him, noticed the payment portal showed restrictions, noticed the casual comfort he'd been living in was gone. And he called me one night, his tone different, cautious, asking if I'd done something. And I told him no, told him the bank must be sorting things out, told him not to worry. And I could hear the unease creeping into his voice because uncertainty is terrifying when you've been relying on someone else's silence to survive. And from that point on, his confidence unraveled quickly. He started over-explaining things no one asked about, started sending me messages reassuring me that he'd handle everything, started mentioning lawyers casually, as if dropping the word would scare me. But it didn't, because I'd already spoken to one, quietly, carefully, laying out the facts without emotion, and the lawyer's reaction had been immediate and very telling. He didn't ask if I wanted to pursue action, he asked how long I'd been documenting everything, because the longer the timeline, the stronger the case. And as my brother spiraled, trying to regain control of a situation he no longer understood, I realized the most important part of waiting wasn't revenge, it was clarity. Because when the truth finally surfaced, there would be no shouting and no dramatic reveal, just a simple question directed at him, one he wouldn't be able to answer. And I knew then that the ending was already written. He just hadn't read it yet. The closer everything got to the surface, the more my family tried to pull me back into silence, because discomfort has a way of making people protective of the version of reality that hurts them the least. And once the lender officially confirmed they were investigating the loan for identity misuse, my brother stopped pretending everything was fine and started panicking in ways he couldn't fully hide, showing up unannounced, calling late at night, asking questions that sounded casual but were really probes, trying to figure out how much I knew and how far I'd gone. And every time he asked, I gave him nothing. Not lies, just vagueness, because ambiguity kept him off balance. And while he was scrambling, my parents shifted from dismissive to defensive, warning me again not to take things too far, telling me families don't involve outsiders, that mistakes happen, that my brother was under stress. And what struck me wasn't just their loyalty to him, but how quickly they framed the situation as something I was doing to him rather than something he'd done to me. And that reframing hurt more than the betrayal itself, because it made one thing painfully clear. They were more afraid of consequences than of injustice. And by then, the investigation had moved beyond feelings anyway, because the lender requested formal documentation, sworn statements, identity verification records, and timelines, all of which I had ready. Not because I was organized by nature, but because waiting had forced me to be. And when I submitted everything, the response was swift and clinical. The account was officially frozen, the payments were suspended, and a fraud marker was placed on the loan pending resolution, which meant my brother no longer had access to the account at all. And that's when he finally cracked, calling me in a rage, accusing me of betraying him, of overreacting, of trying to ruin his life. And I listened quietly as he spoke, because anger reveals things people never intend to admit. And in his rant, he slipped, mentioning details only the person who took out the loan would know, confirming everything without realizing it. And for a moment, I almost interrupted him, almost told him it was over, but I didn't, because the most powerful position I had was restraint. And days later, the lender scheduled a formal review call, one that included their fraud department, a compliance officer, and a legal representative. And I was given the option to attend alone or name a suspect. And that decision weighed on me more than I expected, because naming him meant making the conflict explicit, permanent. But not naming him wouldn't protect him either. It would simply delay the inevitable. And in the end, I chose clarity over comfort, because protecting him had already cost me too much. So I provided his name, not with anger, not with accusation, but as a fact, supported by evidence. And when the call ended, there was no dramatic announcement, no immediate justice, just a quiet acknowledgement that responsibility would be reassigned once the investigation concluded. But the real fallout didn't come from the lender, it came from the family. Because once my brother realized I'd formally named him, he stopped calling altogether, replaced by messages from relatives urging me to reconsider, to fix this before it gets worse, as if consequences were something I was choosing rather than something he'd triggered. And I started to understand that revenge wasn't loud or satisfying in the way movies portray it. It was isolating. It was being willing to be misunderstood in exchange for being safe. And as the days passed, I watched my brother's world tighten. The car he'd shown off disappeared from his driveway, the trips stopped, the confidence drained, and all of it happened without me saying another word. Because once systems get involved, they don't care about family dynamics. They care about documentation. And documentation doesn't take sides. It just tells the truth. And I knew then that the final moment wouldn't be when the lender ruled in my favor. It would be when my brother realized that the silence he'd mistaken for forgiveness had actually been the space where consequences were growing. The end didn't arrive with an argument or a courtroom scene like people imagine. It arrived quietly, the way most irreversible things do, through an email marked Final Determination, one I opened alone, sitting at my kitchen table, reading each line slowly as if speed might somehow change the outcome. And according to the lender's conclusion, the loan had been officially classified as fraudulent. My liability was removed entirely, the debt was reassigned, and the negative marks on my credit were scheduled for removal, a clean reversal on paper that felt heavier than I expected. Not because I felt victorious, but because relief has a strange way of bringing grief with it. Grief for the relationship I thought I had, grief for the version of my family that no longer existed. And I didn't tell anyone right away. Not my parents, not my brother, because by then the truth was already moving faster than I ever could. My brother found out when the lender contacted him directly, when the reality he'd been avoiding finally had his name on it, and his reaction wasn't anger this time, it was desperation, showing up at my door unannounced, standing there quieter than I'd ever seen him, asking me to help him fix it, asking me to explain how it went so wrong, as if the outcome were a mystery rather than a consequence. And for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him, because watching someone face the weight of their own choices is uncomfortable, even when they deserve it. But that sympathy faded when he asked me to call the lender and clear things up, as if I could undo the truth now that it was inconvenient. And that was the moment I realized he still didn't understand what he'd done. He thought the problem was exposure, not betrayal. And I told him no, calmly, without raising my voice. I told him I'd done everything I could to protect myself, that the rest was out of my hands. And he left without another word. And in the weeks that followed, the family response was exactly what I'd expected, and still somehow disappointing. Some relatives stopped calling altogether, others treated me politely but distantly. My parents oscillated between disappointment and forced normalcy, never quite apologizing, never quite acknowledging the cost of their silence. And my brother faded from family gatherings entirely, a quiet absence that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. And as my credit recovered and my life slowly returned to balance, I started to understand that revenge hadn't been about punishment, it had been about boundaries, about refusing to carry someone else's consequences just to keep the peace. And sometimes I think about the version of events where I'd confronted him immediately, where I'd yelled, accused, demanded answers. And I realize how little that would have changed, because people who believe they're entitled to your sacrifice don't respond to emotion, they respond to reality. And reality is patient, it waits, it documents, it corrects itself when given the chance. And the last time I heard from my brother, months later, it was a short message, not an apology, not even an explanation, just a statement. He said he never thought I'd actually go through with it. And I didn't reply because by then there was nothing left to say. The silence had done its job. It had protected me. It had revealed the truth. And it had taught me something I'll carry forever, that letting someone think they've gotten away with it isn't weakness. It's choosing the moment when the truth hits hardest. And when it doesn't need your voice to be loud. It just needs you to step aside and let it land.